So, my topic here, sort of a continuance of the last essay, is baseball cards as American language. So, I kind of want to delve deeply into this because this is a very specifically American phenomenon. I want to say 20th century American phenomenon where the baseball card really emerges as a powerful way of translating and communicating the language of baseball to a very large group of people. It's a way of making the images and the meaning of baseball, as well as the figures who constitute it, immediately accessible. So, what I have here is the Jackie Robinson 1954 Topps card, and I think this is a really great example because this is when the baseball card really becomes institutionalized, with the Topps sets of the 50s, right? This there before there was a kind of a diffuse. There's tobacco, there's candy, there's many different issues that pop up. Bubblegum, get the Goudies, um, that pop up and they swirl, right? They're trying to create ground or establish what is the identity or the fabric of the baseball card, and it coalesces in 1950, 51, 52 when Topps buys out Bowman and establishes itself as the baseball card creator. And through that, you have some of, if not consistently, the most iconic designs in baseball card history. And I would also say, honestly, art history and American art history in these early to mid 50s sets. And the reason why I say this is you look at what a baseball card is, it's a very egalitarian form. These are highly, highly accessible at the time when they emerged, right? It's obviously different now because they're looked back on as history and as artifacts. These are now quote unquote vintage, but you look back at them now. Um, it's hard to imagine how accessible these were. They're made on cheap pieces of cardboard, right? These are literally images printed on cardboard, and I want to dig a little more into that specifically because I think that's really the key to understanding baseball cards. Is that for a long time, I talked about this in my T3 essay. For a long time in Western art history, you have this very, I don't know how to describe it, aristocratic art sense, right? The art is being made for kings or being made for rulers or the upper class, the Medicis in Italy, for example, in the Renaissance period. Um, these are art historical artifacts that are meant to be grandiose, right? They're meant to be uh, significant paintings that depict significant mythologies, right? Whether that's the Christian myth or religion, whether that's Greek mythology, for instance. You have a really radical shift that happens in America around American mythology, specifically American mythology, as it relates to the art or the images, the visual images that represent it and the way that they're distributed. So again, this was in the T3 essay. So this is an extension of something that's it's been ongoing here. Um, these are cheap pieces of cardboard that are distributed in a highly egalitarian way, right? There's a lot of these mid 50s top sets. We're talking about the mid 50s because this is when the baseball card really solidifies and institutionalizes itself. It declares itself, um, as opposed to the first 50 years of the baseball card, and even 70, if you want to go back to like the old judges, where it's still figuring out what its identity is, who it is, what it is. Um, this card, 54, is a perfect example of American myth and art history intertwining and making a very like egalitarian and democratic declaration of what American art is and American culture is. It's This is my card that I would choose as representative of all baseball cards. Period, because not only the 54 Topps design, but also because of Jackie Robinson. This is a level of like iconic historical art history that for me far surpasses anything that happens in America otherwise with Warhol or any of these other people who were active in this period, the mid-century period. before and after, because what it is it's a declaration of America's identity and its principles. Let me see if I can dig deeper into that. The the pop art element of baseball cards has been present since the lithographic printing machine method existed, which is all the way back in 1909 with the caramels and the T206s. The flat color, the pop of figures, the strangeness of backgrounds and juxtaposition with the attempt to establish context, whether it's fielding or throwing or hitting. This is very pop art style, and you can see it in American baseball cards all the way back to 1909. But it's just so very clear in the 1954 set. I think a lot of this is for legibility purposes and reasons, um, as well as it is just ease of printing, right? You don't have these very high, complex, high contrast backgrounds. You pull the figure out, slap a flat color in the back, and that prints just a thick sheet of yellow, and then you have the contrasting color gradients in the figure itself. So I think there's that element, but we're kind of talking about this as a holistic visual language, right? So there's obviously the components of the image. Um, you have the details on the back. This card talks about Jackie Robinson's philanthropic work with youth in the country. Um, Talks about his skill on the field in terms of his bio. You have all of his statistics. Um, this is a way of documenting, right? I want to make that clear. This is a way of documenting history. These are pieces of art. They're declarations of American identity in terms of America as a culture and baseball as America's culture, um, as well as ways of documenting America's history, right? So if you think of like ancient frescoes, or you think of the writings of Plutarch and these kind of ancient Greek and Roman recoveries of history, we have a process here in real time that's simultaneously mythologizing by way of art images the American myth itself, baseball, um, as well as documenting uh, in a historical process of we're marking time with the cultural achievements of our culture's greatest figures. And so there's something to be said here with Jackie Robinson in terms of the merging of culture and politics, because you have different kinds of history, right? You have a political history, which is typically wars, conquests, power, economic, it's class-based issues, race-based issues. You have these constellations of civilizations and the way that they create boundaries and borders. This is more of a political history of a country, whereas a cultural history is usually a for entertainment purposes, for joy and enjoyment. That's what's created inside the insulated bubble of a culture or a civilization is the cultural history. Um, but you have figures, I think Jackie Robinson, bar none, is the best example, who cross those borders, right? Who make it clear that there is no such thing as a cultural history without a political one, and vice versa. Obviously, shattering the color barrier in 1947. It's a huge moment where America's dominant cultural mythology collides with America's political realities and presents you with a full holistic vision and view of why, in a lot of ways, culture is first and foremost the way in which nations or civilizations politically evolve. Right? Culture is the lens through which a nation or a civilization views itself, and then through that lens, it reflects upon itself. Right? So if we're watching baseball and all of a sudden you have a black player on the professional U.S. baseball fields for the first time in decades, you're asking yourself, why did this take so long to happen? Why am I having a positive or a negative response to this, et cetera, et cetera? It's a vision, right? The same way that you think about TV or movies. These are visions of ourselves as a collective, and the dominant cultural myths and formations are the way through which civilizations envision themselves. This is the same. I talked about this with Plato in terms of wrestling and the Olympic Games, as well as the Greek theater. These are all ways through which civilizations achieve a level of self-reflection. Um, And so when you're looking at the baseball card as specifically American, it's a very, very, very revolutionary device because of how egalitarian it is, the way in which it is produced, and the material upon which it is produced, right? So I talked about the cardboard, which is very cheap, right? Very plentiful, but you have these really high quality and really beautiful art images that are transposed on the cardboard. Um, in addition to that, the egalitarian method of distribution, which is I went into that in the T3 essay, um, which is these are mass produced, widely available, produced through industrial means, right? Again, this is very American economics, American capitalism, um, produced through industrial means by companies that become consolidated. First, it's to sell cigarettes or sell candy or gum. It becomes consolidated, and the cards themselves actually become a product. First, they're a marketing tool, and then they themselves are a product. It shows the emergence of an American art form that actually mirrors American values, right? So if you think about the Constitution or the founding documents of American civilization, um, you can think about that document, right, and then look at baseball cards through that lens, and it's one of the most clear examples, I think, of American ideals being translated over time. And so, what I mean by that is that you have these very lofty egalitarian ideals. All men are created equal. They're attempting to establish a secular society where um, all religions can be respected, right, or appreciated. They're attempting to create a society which is actually very revolutionary in terms of how inclusive it is, right? And so you look at the development of the baseball card through that lens as a cultural product of America's dominant cultural mythology, and you can see broad scale and broad scope through again through the material, through the art style, through the way they're produced and distributed. Um, these are all ways of creating that reflection. If you understand what I'm saying, and this is it's a complex thing because what we're trying to do here is look at America itself through its primary cultural phenomenon, which I would say in its most formative and national or world politically declaring years, which is the 20th century. Its primary cultural paradigm, right? I mean, Hollywood gets bigger and bigger, but you're still looking at, especially like mid-century, Yankees, Dodgers, Giants. You're looking at baseball as just the phenomenon in American culture and society. You're looking at its primary cultural product, baseball, through baseball's primary cultural product, which is the baseball card. That becomes solidified again mid-century. So I hope I'm making this clear because it is again it's complex. It's a compound topic. We're not just talking about a art historical declaration, right? These baseball cards are very clearly pop art, and pop art being America's art historical economic contribution to the landscape of art history itself. Everything that pop art represents is the commercialism and the ennui and the uh, confusion of hyper materialism that almost represents the American political consciousness or the American spirit or the American soul. It's this hyper material, everything can and will be sold, business marketing perspective that's laid on top of a real history of violence and oppression um, in order to establish the economic and political possibilities that we now know as American society or civilization. We're looking at that, right? But we're also let me see how I can put this. We're looking at the way in which the myth is constituting itself. So it's complex and it's almost hidden because these baseball cards they seem very innocuous, right? But at the same time, they are a way of creating mass-produced art as well as a mass-produced narrative and story, as well as a way for the culture at large to actively participate, possess, own, and engage the myth in a way that is not just ephemeral. These baseball cards last, right? There's entire catalogs of them. There are, I mean, thousands upon thousands of these cards from different sets, different years, that they're almost being mass archived, so to speak. They're being mass stewarded into the future by people who are deeply devoted to not only the baseball game but baseball cards. Um, these are prized possessions for a lot of people. And so when I think about baseball cards, I think about the fact that they're produced on cardboard. I think is something that's deeply meaningful to me because it really hits this space. It's almost like a spiritual space between meaning and nothingness. They're not pretending to be some sort of highfalutin historical artifact. They're not being proclaimed, other than like those Honus Wagner T206 cards, as like foundational cultural artifacts or documents. These are they're mass produced and they had sticks of bubblegum with them, right? There's a element of childishness and even meaninglessness that's associated with them. But I think that's where the beauty really comes from, and it's something that's very different and almost absurd. That is so particular to American culture and American social values, because what you're grappling with in the 50s themselves, and I talked about this, is the existentialist revelation of a hyper modern, hyper global society, and the fallout of the loss of values that occurs during that period of time. And in a lot of ways, baseball becomes a cultural myth out of almost necessity because you lose a lot of what previously were the traditional values of Western civilization themselves, right? There was a sense of regional boundedness, and the regional religious, social, and cultural mythologies were very self-contained. Um, through the sport of baseball and through the culture of baseball, you have the ability not only for America but for countries like Cuba, in its attempt to become sovereign from the colonial empire of Spain, to establish themselves and create a collective cultural identity through that event, through that phenomenon, through that collective experience, much in the same way that the Greeks would gather in the theaters and experience the plays of the great Greek tragedians, and have collective experiences in Rome and in the Colosseums, etc. So I don't want to like understate that level of importance and that dynamic that's happening there. So when you look at that, right, you're looking at these works of art that are cultural forms of documentation and actually establish and uphold the myth itself, right? Because these are moments in time, right? These are still images that are iconographic, right? This Jackie Robinson, again, a great example. It's an iconographic still image that holds in time something eternal about the ephemeral nature of the game of baseball itself. And it's not proclaiming itself to be a major work of art or a major painting or major photograph, whatever, what have you. These are not considered typically cultural documents, and that's precisely what's important about them from a very egalitarian social and political perspective. Um, I think I've kind of rounded this out and rounded it about here, um, in a pretty clear way. Actually, surprisingly short period of time. I don't think much more needs to be said in terms of these documents. Um, the persistence of them, I think, is incredibly important. But I don't know. That's what I got. That's the riff. It's just something that came up. So I hope you enjoy.